Dear colleagues, dear participants from all over the world, I would like to welcome you to our first conference in the Horst Kächele webinar series at the IPU Berlin. And just going to say a few words on who is our titular saint here, Horst Kächele. Professor Dr. Horst Kächele, a medical doctor and a psychoanalyst and a late psychologist. I think he wrote his doctoral dissertation in psychology at the age of 70 years or something. He has been with us at IPU since the founding of our university in 2009 and sadly passed away in 2020. He was one of the most important advocates of a research-based and clinically sensitive psychoanalysis. In his 3-volume textbook of psychoanalysis, edited together with Helmut Thome, is a basic text not only for German psychoanalysts. It has been translated into numerous languages. I stopped counting at 15 foreign editions from English to Bulgarian, Russian, and Ukrainian, just to give some examples. In the spirit of our curious interdisciplinarity, which, by the way, also characterized the physician and neuroscientist Sigmund Freud, with his strong affinity for and also a strong network in psychology and cultural sciences, the Horst Kächele webinar is defined to be dedicated to academic disputes, to fiery discussions, as we hope, and thus the search for truth. And that always means questioning one's own prejudices. We can expect such a noble discussion from our two guests of this afternoon. Professor Dr. Mark Solms is a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and psychoanalyst. The order is important here because he actually came from neuroscience to psychoanalysis, mainly because the concept in cognitive neuroscience became too shallow for him, not substantial enough. It seemed to him, he reports, that the classical neuroscientists were trying to reconstruct the mental life and at the same time excluding the mental. In psychoanalysis, his many writings, also his editing of the journal Neuropsychoanalysis, which he founded and even coined the term psychoanalysis. And last not least, his work as an editor of Freud's pre-analytical writings made him one of the central inspirations of our contemporary psychoanalytic theoretical discourse. At the same time, he brings his discourse into the exchange with the neurosciences at a very high level. Think, for example, of Eric Kandel, Jaak Panksepp, Damasio, and Friston. His recent book, which I'm showing here, The Hidden Spring, he challenges the widely shared assumption that consciousness is a so-called higher cortical function and assigns it to the brainstem effect, which with the consequence of acknowledging consciousness in all mammals in general. Also, he addresses the hard problem of consciousness or subjectivity on clinical, neurophysiological, and also philosophical grounds. The book is unfortunately not yet available in German. Therefore, I showed you some of his older publications that are available in German for our German audience. But it will be edited. It's in translation right now. And since it's not available, I show you an idea for a possible cover that I made up to give you an example. Of course, Solms's theories are also a thorn in the flesh of the psychoanalytic community, you can imagine, because we don't always have a very easy time with concepts that challenge our splendid isolation in the epistemology of its own kind, of which we are, on the one hand, rightly proud. but he does not shy away from conceptual debate. We experienced that yesterday evening when in another webinar he discussed his theoretical concepts with critical theorist Christine Kirchhoff, also from IPU. Today, he also will hopefully find refreshing headwinds from Professor Dr. Thomas Fuchs. He is also a psychiatrist and a philosopher. He is a professor for the philosophical foundations of psychiatry as Karl Jaspers, a professor in Heidelberg. So he is a psychiatrist and also a full professional in philosophy. Sometimes if I think of Thomas, he reminds me of an organ player, an organist with his many keyboards and registers playing on. That's how he's like living with the history of philosophy. And this image of his is already says something about his way of doing philosophy, like it has to do with the body. It has to do with the body of being in the world. One of his main manuals as the organ player is certainly Phenomenology, with a clear sympathy to the science-friendly variants of this discipline, like Edmund Husserl or Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and a little less inclination to the more mystic variant of, for example, Heidegger. In his book, Ecology of the Brain, now also published in English, you see the German and the English edition here, he argues that neither a philosophy nor a psychology of the mind is possible without taking into account the bodily being in the world. In this book, he criticizes neuroscientific reductionism, and he does not entirely spare Max Solms from this criticism. Also, Jaak Pansep, one of Solms's main reference authors. So we will see how much of these objections will be discussed today. I will just mention a third author, which is not present, who is not present here, but who is present in the title of our webinar, David Chalmers, who in 1995 introduced the concept of the hard problem of consciousness, which is since being widely discussed, the book. He claims that phenomenal consciousness is a fact of nature that cannot be deduced or causally and not pinned to physical substrates, if I get it right, yeah. Not averse to shy hypothesis, he also, in his recent book, Reality Plus, he states that virtual reality is as real as the reality we used to know outside, which seems a little audacious to me. And I'm very curious if in one of his discussions with Bishop Berkeley, he would hopefully not be interrupted by some dog biting the cable, because if you do dwell in virtual reality, you should always make sure that someone is heating the non-virtual power plants. But this is just a remark besides, and maybe our discussions will also touch the question of virtual reality now. But dear avatars outside on your Zoom screens, let us expect a lively discussion and let the games begin. Thank you.
I was struck by Professor Stürmer commenting earlier that she's very pleased that we do still consider it to be a hard problem. So I want to start with an appeal that we should not set a higher bar scientifically for consciousness than for anything else. I fear some people think the hard problem is here to be revered rather than to be solved. So here is the hard problem as articulated by David Chalmers. He says that what makes it hard is that consciousness cannot be reduced to our normal way of doing cognitive neuroscience, which is to reduce it to a functional explanation. He said that even after we've done this, there still remains a further question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? And Chalmers is not alone in this perplexity about the special nature of consciousness. He's building on the work, among others, of Tom Nagel, who said, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it's like for the organism. And he said, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. So what I would like to do with most of my 25 minutes is to give you a clue about how this could be done. Before I proceed, I want to be clear about what the questions are that I'm addressing. Here is Chalmers's question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? And here's the way that Nagel put it. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? Now, here is that functional approach that Chalmers was criticizing. And I'd like to dive straight in by saying that I agree with him because he's talking about the work that was done since the 1990s, led by the charge on the solving of the problem of consciousness was led by Francis Crick and his collaborators. And he chose to focus on visual consciousness. And this led people like Chalmers to say, all of this kind of information processing diagram doesn't tell us why there is something it is like to see. And when I say I agree with that. I think that this information processing diagram, this description of the functional mechanism of how visual information is processed in the cortex of the brain doesn't explain why there is something it is like to see. Whoops, I see that my slides are frozen. And the main reason for this is clear in the title of this famous review paper by John Fjellstrom, in which he summarizes all of the abundant evidence that has accumulated over the decades for the view that, in fact, a visual perception and every other form of perception can go on in the dark. The title says, perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learnt. We can perceive and learn and perform all of our higher cognitive gymnastics, almost all of them, without there necessarily being any subjective experience of the cortex performing these functions. So in a word, I'm saying that the hard problem arose largely because we started looking for an explanation of a functional mechanistic explanation of consciousness in the wrong place. It was a mistake to look to the visual cortical processes, which can go on in the dark, which are not intrinsically conscious processes. Where we should have started instead was with feelings. The function of feeling is an entirely different story. Here's Sigmund Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, the person who first brought to our awareness that perception and learning and all cognition can go on unconsciously in the dark. But even he, the pioneer of the view that so much of our mental functioning is unconscious, even he said that the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. I've put the word feelings in bold because different people mean different things by words like emotion and affect. For example, Joseph Ledoux seems to think that the word emotion denotes a certain kind of behavior, and therefore they disagree that emotions and affects are necessarily conscious. But I'm sure nobody can disagree that feelings are intrinsically conscious things. There's no such thing as a feeling that you don't feel. If you don't feel it, then it isn't a feeling. So I'm saying rather than looking at vision, which goes on unconsciously, perfectly happily, we should be looking at feeling, because feeling is an intrinsically conscious process. This is where we should have begun in our efforts to solve scientifically the hard problem of consciousness. Here's Chalmers again. I'm not going to read the whole quotation. I've got very little time. But I've put in bold the part that's crucial. He says there is no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And I think the crucial word here is cognitive. There is no cognitive function. That's so. But what if you were to say affective function? Could you say there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience? I'm saying there is one, feeling. I'm saying that I can say in advance that explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain why it feels like something, because that is the whole purpose of the function of feeling, unlike the function of vision. So this is not a semantic argument. I'm not saying something about words, that the word feeling refers to something that's intrinsically conscious. I'm wanting to clarify over the next few slides why I believe that the function of feeling, the functional mechanism of feeling necessarily explains experience. It requires, intrinsically, inherently requires feeling to be generated. And I'm going to show how this works in the brain. On the screen now, I'm highlighting these purple structures in the upper brain stem, not in the cortex, in the upper brain stem, which are known as the reticular activating system. And I'm also highlighting this structure here called the periaqueductal gray. These are the structures that generate consciousness. That's called the reticular activating system because these structures activate the forebrain. Unless the cortex is activated by the reticular activating system, then the cortex isn't conscious. This was learned in 1948 already, when Magoon and Maruzzi severed the connection between, just made a small little lesion, disconnecting the reticular activating system from the cortex. And the patient, it wasn't a patient, it was an unfortunate cat. The cat went into a coma. And this has been observed in human patients in which naturally occurring lesions located in and around the reticular activating system. They reliably produce coma. They switch the lights off. And I've put this number here to show that the smallest lesion that is necessary to produce coma in humans is a mere 2 cubic millimeters. So the size of a match head. Damage in this part of the reticular activating system, the size of a match head, reliably produces coma in human beings. So we've known since 1948 that the cortex can't be conscious unless it's activated by the reticular activating system. So why didn't that put end to the idea that the cortex is the source of consciousness? It's because the brain stem, the reticular activating system in particular, was seen as a sort of power source. It's a sort of power supply, which was a necessary prerequisite. You've got to switch the cortex on before it can do its job. That doesn't mean that the qualities and the contents of consciousness are not generated in the brain stem. That's what the argument was. So what I'm going to show you over the next few slides is the evidence that the brain stem by itself actually generates not just a power supply, not just switches on the sort of machinery of the cortex, but rather produces directly a quality and a content of consciousness that we call feeling. Here is a child who was born with no cortex. She's 3 years old. You can see her brain stem is fine. There's the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain, and above that, it ends. She doesn't even have a thalamus, and she has no forebrain. She has no cortex. So if the cortex was the source of consciousness, then this child should be in a coma. But she's not in a coma. Here she is. She wakes up in the morning, goes to sleep at night, and much more interesting than that, she responds emotionally to adequate stimuli. Like, for example, her baby brother is placed on her lap and she goes, she likes it. And she likewise responds with fright if she's startled. She arches her back and cries and complains if she's frustrated. She becomes scared if she's placed in a situation in which she's in danger, and so on. All the basic emotional responses are present in this child who has no cortex. How does that happen? Well, let's just use vision as the example. Visual information from the eye goes to the thalamus, and from there to the visual cortex, and that's where we do this cortical visual conscious information processing. But information from the eye also goes to the brainstem, to the superior colliculi in particular, where the information is registered unconsciously. And then right next to that is the periaqueductal gray, which is where the emotional response to the visually unconscious information is generated, and the child displays this emotion. It's not only that one child that I showed you, this is regularly the case with these kids. Here's another such child with absolutely no cortex. Now, the problem is that many of my colleagues say, well, how do you know that there is something it is like to be this child? Maybe they are zombies who look as if they're conscious, but in fact, there's nothing going on inside. That, by the way, I find quite a curious notion. A child who's awake and who's responding emotionally to stimuli, that they would be blank inside, I find rather an unlikely possibility. But it is a possibility because these children can't speak. They can't tell us what it's like to be them. So in science, we have to look for other lines of evidence because the lesion evidence, remember, damage to the brainstem, the teeny bit of damage to the brainstem switches off the lights completely, removing the cortex in its entirety does not. The emotional feelings are still there. But because we can't interrogate these kids as to what it is like to be them, we need to look to other lines of evidence. And I'll quickly whiz through those. If you stimulate the reticular activating system electrically, if you stimulate it, the prediction from the view that the brainstem is the source of feeling would be that you would generate a feeling by stimulating that structure. And that's exactly what you do. I'm just giving you one example, the substantia nigra, stimulated in the case of this woman. Within 5 seconds of the stimulator being put on, she fell into a suicidal depression. I've got the words in bold, showing what I mean by suicidal depression. She had no psychiatric history. It's just the stimulating of that particular part of the reticular activating system switches on dramatic depression. This is reported by Blomstedt. And when the electrode is switched off, within 90 seconds, the depression disappears. I'm just giving you one example. Stimulation of different brainstem sites in the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray generate intense affects, a wide variety of affects, and nothing of the kind is elicited by cortical stimulation. So this is another kind of evidence over and above the lesion evidence. What about functional imaging evidence? This is a study by Damasio in which he imaged with positron emission tomography which part of the brain, where is the highest metabolic activity when the brain of normal people are in intense emotional states. He looked here at joy, sadness, happiness, and fear, and you see where the activation is. It's in the brainstem, in the brainstem, in the brainstem, in the brainstem. It's not in the cortex. In fact, in most instances, the cortex is deactivated during intense emotional states. So this is exactly what you would predict, again, if the affects are actually generated by and in the brainstem. A last line of evidence is chemical manipulation. All of these chemicals, which are regularly and routinely modulated by psychopharmacological drugs, like antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti-anxiety drugs. If this part of the brain was just a power supply, only anesthetists would be interested in it. But all of these neuromodulators are sourced in the reticular activating system. So this is not just generating a blank wakefulness, it's generating affect, it's generating emotional affects. Otherwise, why would psychiatric drugs act on these neuromodulator systems? So this is the sort of evidence for the view that the basic form of consciousness, which is a necessary prerequisite for any other form of consciousness to exist, that arises from the reticular activating system and periaqueductal way of the brain stem, and it has a quality and it has a content, and that is feeling, affect. And remember, because it's really terribly important, that this is the part of the brain which is the font of all consciousness. So this suggests that the basic foundational elemental form of consciousness is feeling, is affect. So then, what is the mechanism of feeling? I said that this mechanism must explain how feeling comes about and why feeling comes about. Unlike visual information processing, which is not intrinsically conscious, what is the mechanism of this sort of processing? And basically, the mechanism is homeostasis. These upper brainstem structures are homeostasis regulating structures. So this is the functional mechanism of feeling. Homeostasis is the mechanism whereby we stay within our viable bounds. We have to be within a particular temperature range, particular blood oxygen range, a particular water to salt range. You need a certain amount of glucose, etc. And if you deviate from those viable bounds, then the body has to do work to get you back there. You have to be brought back into, for example, your viable temperature range, your viable oxygen range, and so on. That's how homeostasis works. In order to keep you alive, if you don't stay within those ranges, it's rather frightening, actually, how narrow those ranges are. If you don't remain within those ranges, you die. Now, there are many homeostatic mechanisms in the brainstem. Many of them are regulated autonomically, but the extended form of homeostasis that gives rise to feeling has the additional property that you don't only have reflexes, like, for example, if you're too hot, your body automatically perspires and increases your respiration rate, and that cools you down. Breathing is automatic, thermoregulation is automatic, blood pressure regulation is automatic, and that's because it's entirely predictable what to do. There's just one thing you do if your blood pressure goes too high. Your vessel, the dilation of your vessels is altered, and the heart rate is altered, and that corrects it. But what if you move into an uncertain situation? If you're in a situation in which reflexes do not solve the problem, like, for example, respiratory control is normally automatic, but now you find yourself in a carbon dioxide-filled room, you don't have a reflex for what to do, because now you're in a state of uncertainty. And so you need to make choices. You need voluntary actions over and above the stereotyped automatic ones that are given by these innate reflexes and instincts. And this is what feeling is for. It's innate. So if you're in this carbon dioxide-filled room, you've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one. So you don't know what to do. So you feel your way through the problem. If you go upstairs and the oxygen level reduces, you feel the intensely increasing unpleasure of suffocation along. If you go downstairs and there the oxygen supply increases, then you feel the relief, and the feeling tells you you've made the right decision. So feeling enables choice, and choice enables voluntary action. And that is the function of feeling. That's what it's there for. And I hope you can see what an enormous adaptive advantage it provides. It provides not only for you to be able to survive in unpredicted situations, which are far from rare in nature. It's far from rare to find yourself in a novel situation for which there's not a reflexive, instinctual, stereotyped response. It not only enables you to do that by feeling your way through the problem, the feeling tells you whether you're making the right or the wrong choice, but it also enables you to learn from the experience, because the next time you find yourself in the same situation, you've learned from the previous encounter what works and what doesn't work. This is what feeling adds. And this is why we feel, and this is how we feel. I know I'm rushing through this. There's a lot of detail that I'm skimming over, but that's the basic idea. Now, I need to add this thing that I've underlined down here is we don't just have feeling in general. We have different categories of feeling. You need to know what the feeling is about. So suffocation alarm feels different from thirst, feels different from sleepiness, feels different from hunger, just as fear feels different from anger, feels different from lust, feels different from separation distress. These are categorically distinct needs. So you need to know which category of need are we talking about. It's not just total need. And this is where qualities come in. The pleasure versus unpleasure continuum is a continuous variable, but the different needs are categorical variables because each of them has to be met in their own right. And categorical variables are distinguished from each other qualitatively. So here we have a mechanism which is inherently subjective. It's about the state of the organism. It's inherently valuative. In other words, there's an innate goodness and badness to it. It's intrinsic to the function that there's a goodness and a badness where basically moving out of your homeostatic bounds is bad because it means you can die. And it's good to move back into your homeostatic bounds because it means you're going to survive. So these choices are rooted in the most basic value system of living things, which is that it's good to survive and to reproduce, and it's bad not to do so. This is what feeling registers subjectively for the organism so that it can make these choices. And then in addition, it is inherently qualitative for the reasons that I've just said. And that, dear colleagues, simply is what a feeling is. It's a subjective state which has intrinsic value, existential value for the organism. And it's also essentially and necessarily qualitative. That, I say again, just is feeling. And feeling is the basic form of consciousness. So I hope you can see that this question is not so perplexing. Why and how is there something it's like to be an organism? Something it's like for the organism? Come on, it's clear why, and how. It's as simple as that. Likewise, this question, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? As I said to you earlier, that's a perfectly reasonable question when it comes to vision. But how can the function I've just described, why is it accompanied by experience? Well, of course, it's because that's what it's for. It's so that the creature can know how it's doing in this inherently subjective, intrinsically existentially value-laden, qualitatively distinctive way. That simply is what feeling is. Now, I'm afraid that probably Thomas Fuchs will agree with most of what I said, so there'll be very little for us to argue about. So I'm going to end on what I think will be a bone of contention between us. And my view is that if homeostasis is such a simple mechanism, then it surely can be reduced to computations. There are simple laws governing homeostasis. And basically how every homeostat works, it has a receptor, here called sensory state. It has an effector, the active state. So it receives information and it does things. And it has a control center, here called internal states. That's how homeostats work. And they're very simple equations which describe how this business works. When the control center senses I'm moving out of my viable bounds, then it produces an action in the outside world, which brings about a change in its sensory state, bringing it back into its viable bounds. This action is predicted by the control center, predicted to have that sensory consequence, and that's what brings it back into its viable bounds. Now, when we move into the higher levels of homeostasis, where you can learn from your mistakes, if what you predict will happen in the outside world, in fact, does not happen, and your sensory state is not what you expected, you get an error signal. And the error signal is used to update the control center's predictive model. I hope that that's clear. So it's not just a matter of control center. I predict that if I do that, this will happen. And if that doesn't happen, I die. It is, if that doesn't happen, then I have a basis for changing my mind about what I did. And this thing down here, which is called precision, which is just a technical term for uncertainty that I showed you in this earlier slide here. This is what modulates your uncertainty. And this is what the brainstem does. In physiological terms, the reticular activating system, what it does in physiological terms, we call it arousal or the modulation of postsynaptic gain. I won't go into the technical details of that now, but it's basically modulating your predictions, the confidence that you have. In other words, how much uncertainty is there about your predictions over the error signals? Because you have to modulate as your confidence in your prediction increases, so your confidence in the error signal decreases and vice versa. The crucial point is that this is intrinsically affective on the basis of what I said to you earlier. And the easiest way to formulate it in one simple sentence is that it is bad when, well, let me rather put it this way around. It is good when things turn out as expected. In other words, if your cognitive predictions, your plans, your policies as to how do I get back into my viable oxygen range, if your plan is working, then that's good. So it's good when things turn out as expected, and it's bad when uncertainty prevails. So the modulation of the precision or the confidence in the error signal over the predictive construction, this is modulated by feeling in the way that I've just described, and that can be reduced to an equation. This work was done together with Carl Friston. This equation is a simplified version of how feeling works mechanistically. Now, this is my second last slide. The famous physicist Richard Feynman, when he died, this was found on his blackboard. He said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And I agree very strongly with that statement. If that mechanism that I've just described, this extended form of homeostasis, this modulation by the system of the system's own uncertainty in the predictions it is making as to how to stay alive, how to continue to exist as a system. If this truly is the causal mechanism whereby the most elementary form of consciousness arises, then we should be able to engineer it. Because as Feynman said, if you can't engineer it, you don't understand it. You haven't really got the causal mechanism. And so this is the alarming conclusion that I am going to end with. I believe that if we have a mechanistic account of how feeling arises, then we should be able to engineer an artificial form of feeling. It should be possible to produce an artificial system which has drives, in other words, which has needs like power needs, temperature needs, needs not to damage its parts, and that if it had this built-in mechanism that I've described earlier, it should be able to monitor by virtue of feeling states whether what choices to make and whether things are going well or badly for it. In other words, it should show voluntary behavior rooted in feelings. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but despite my own prejudice against artificial intelligence in the past, I've come to the view that this is possible in principle. In fact, I think it's imminent that this will be possible, will be engineered, and I am proud to be part of a team that is working on this. We've been at it for over a year now. We reported our first results on Friday, and I think this will be the major talking point with Thomas Fuchs when we come to debate things. So, as I said, I just want to give you a clue. That's a rough and ready outline of how I think we might be able to resolve this hard problem of consciousness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very brief but very impressive showing your thesis. And Thomas, now it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm understandable. And while I start right away, maybe a bit different take on the hard problem, which I would rather call its dissolution than its solution. But let me start with pointing out that the heart problem is not new. It was first formulated in 1872 by Émile de Bois-Reymond in his famous speech on the limits of knowledge of nature. So I quote, "What conceivable connection exists between certain movements of certain atoms in my brain on the one hand, and the other hand, the experiences of pain, pleasure, sweetness, or the scent of roses. It is in no way conceivable how consciousness could arise from the interaction of atoms." And he ended his speech with the famous sentence, "Ignoramus ignorabimus." We will never be able to reduce consciousness to material processes. Now, 150 years later, de Bois-Reymond is by no means outdated. On the contrary, all efforts of philosophy of mind and neurobiology to find a solution of this riddle can be considered as failed. And David Chalmers was already quoted. I quote him again because it is quite similar to de Bois-Reymond. If our cognitive systems process visual and auditory information, how is it that we have visual and auditory experiences? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle C. Why would physical processing produce a rich inner life at all? And consciousness, Chalmers concludes, would obviously have to be an irreducible feature in the world. Thomas Nagel was also mentioned by Mark already. He came to this conclusion in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos, with a provocative subtitle, Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. Now, of course, reductionists hope that sometime and somehow it could be explained how consciousness arises from the windings of the brain. But I want to show briefly why de Bois-Reymond will be right, that is, why the heart problem of consciousness will remain unsolvable, and why it is wrongly posed in the first place. Now, first, reductionism is based on physicalism. And according to it, there is an objective material world which is independent of our observation of our subjectivity, and of which there must be a complete physical description. But physics has excluded from its special section of reality qualitative experience from the outset. For the physicists, there are no colors, sounds, smells, or feelings. They do not appear in their measurements. But since they cannot be even described physically, they can even be less explained within physics. The same applies for subjectivity. That centers of subjective experience and subjective perspective do not appear in any physical measurement of matter or energy processes. So everything what physicists investigate is pure externality. It has no inside. And again, what does not appear at all in physical experiments and measurements, even less can be explained by them. But the decisive reason why the heart problem is per se unsolvable is epistemological. If there should be an objective material world of which there is only one complete physical description, then this description must also contain our own experience and observation of the world itself. But subjectivity and consciousness are what make the world appear to us and to the natural scientist in the first place. They are the precondition of any, including natural scientific knowledge. And therefore, they cannot find themselves an explanation in a world conceived without consciousness. Now, I will shortly describe a different approach to the riddle of consciousness, namely an embodied account that is based on the reality of the living being. And according to this view, consciousness is not located in the brain nor in any one place at all, because it is a function and activity of the living organism as a whole. in a sense, it is distributed among the brain, the body, and the environment. Now, to give a more detailed account of this idea, let's move to neuroscience and see that it is still based on the principal divide between the mental and the physical, between the subjective mind and the objective body. And this is, of course, the physicalist view I already mentioned at the beginning. Somehow the brain or physical events should produce the mind. What is lost in this principal divide is the human person, which is essentially a living being, a living organism. The brain is primarily an organ of the living being, and only by this becomes an organ of the mind. Both life and mind are essentially processes, not things. They are always related to what is beyond them, dependent on the continuous exchange with their environment. William James once asked famously, "Does consciousness exist?" And his bold answer was no, because there is no such thing as consciousness. There are only conscious living beings. Consciousness is not a localizable state. It is not an entity, but a continuous process of relating to and interacting with the environment. It is something that we live and enact. And on this condition, the primary entity is the living being, which brings forth subjective experience. It is the common denominator of the mental and the physical. And its life processes may then be regarded, on the one hand, on the left side, as integral bodily, emotional, intellectual processes, which are experienced from the first-person perspective. On the other hand, they may also be considered and investigated on the right side. Sorry, before it was the left side. Now we are on the right side. Now they may also be considered from a third-person perspective, namely as physiological processes in any degree of detail. So the living being appears under two aspects. On the one hand, as a lived body, left side. On the other hand, as a living or a subject body or object body, the object body. So in German, we have the difference between Leib and Körper. And instead of a gap between two radically different ontologies, the mental and the physical, we are now faced with a duality of aspects within embodiment. And the question now is about the relation between one's body as subjectively experienced and one's body as a living organism. And the answer must be that processes of living and processes of experiencing, Leben and Erleben, are both aspects of the life process seen from two complementary points of view. Well, this is a philosophical concept. To make it a bit more tangible, we can easily see that on a daily basis, a doctor undergoes this change in between both aspects. For instance, when greeting a patient as this person here and seeing his friendly, anxious, or similar gaze, yet shortly afterwards, the doctor might take hold of the ophthalmoscope to examine the patient's eyes as physical organs. Now, looking at them from too close a distance, you can easily see that the gaze, the expression, has vanished. The doctor may even get still closer and investigate the retina. Just like a neuroscientist may explore all the microstructures and microprocesses of the physical body, down to the visual cortex and maybe down to the single neurons and their connections. But the decisive thing is, nowhere will consciousness, mind, or life show themselves, for they are macro phenomena that are only accessible in coexistence from a second person or first person perspective. So instead of zooming in or focusing too much on structures within the brain, we have to look at the wider system. That means at the living body, in order to grasp and understand consciousness. And this is, of course, the approach that since 3 decades has been called the embodied and increasingly the inactive view of cognitive science. And according to this view, consciousness and subjectivity are embodied and enacted through the ongoing interaction of a whole organism with its environment. And in a sense, the brain is for the mind what the lungs are for respiration. They only function in a systemic unity with the environment. And in a sense, the mind is like the air which we inhale. Both breathing and consciousness are functions of life. And this may also be called an ecological view of mind and brain. And if we look at the basis of these functions, we find three permanent modes of embodiment which form this basis: cycles of organismic self-regulation, cycles of sensory-motor interaction with the environment, and cycles of intersubjective interaction. To start with cycles of organismic self-regulation, I can refer here to what Mark has already pointed out. Organismic self-regulation has a conscious and affective dimension, and this is crucial, for it means our primary and vital embodiment. Affective neuroscience, Damasio Panksepp and others have emphasized the dependence of a background consciousness on the homeostatic regulation of the whole body, mediated by and integrated by the brainstem and diencephalic structures. And this means a basic feeling of being alive, a basic self-affection or core consciousness, which is the basis for all higher forms of consciousness. And it integrates the present state of the organism as a whole. And in that sense, processes of life and processes of mind are inseparably linked. Homeostasis is the primary function of consciousness, which Mark already pointed out quite rightly. And of course, similarly, all moods and affects are also bound to the constant interaction of brain and body. They involve nearly all subsystems of the organism. And therefore, all higher activities, such as perceiving, thinking, acting, are not based only on the neocortex, but primarily on the continuous vital and effective regulatory processes involving the whole organism. Neither consciousness nor the brain may be separated from the living body as a whole. Now, of course, apart from inner regulation, the main task of the nervous system is to mediate sensory-motor cycles that connect organism and environment, leading to embodied cognition and action. But from an inactive point of view, organisms do not just passively receive information from the environment, which they then translate into internal models or representations. Rather, they actively participate in the generation of experience and meaning. And implies the intrinsic connection of perception and bodily action. This was already nicely illustrated by a classical experiment of Held and Hein in 1963. They invested two groups of newborn kittens, which are blind at first, and one group was carried around in their environment in a basket, thus only receiving passive visual stimuli, while the other group could move around freely. And when released after 6 weeks, the first group, the active group, was quite able to perceive and move in space perfectly, whereas the other group, the other group of kittens stumbled around helplessly, obviously incapable of any spatial perception. And this shows that perceptual space is something that we create from our active interaction with the environment. Interacting with the environment induced the kitten's brains to develop the structures necessary for its adequate perception. And this is what the inactive approach put forward by Varela and Thompson and others take generally. A cognitive being's world is not just pre-given. Living beings create and enact their specific environment through their interaction with it. So if we look at the traditional model, then there is a representation here of the pair of pliers that is created through a linear process leading to a picture, a representation of a model of the pliers in the brain, which is accompanied by our perception. And instead of this linear account, the embodied account sees the world as constituted for us in the course of a living interaction. We need a whole body. We need arms and hands to perceive the pair of pliers. And in these interaction, the pair of pliers is ready to hand, so to speak. So we can do something with it, and that's how we perceive it. The brain then works as a mediating organ only. It does not produce an inner world representing the outer. It rather provides neural dispositions, tools, or open loops for our interaction with the environment. And they are only closed to full functional cycles by complementary counterparts in the environment. So, as a matter of fact, to know a thing, to perceive and to know a thing means always already to know how to deal with it. And this applies, of course, for motor action as well. My actions are embodied. That means they are not somehow triggered by an inner mind, but they are enacted by me as an embodied subject. And when I'm writing a letter, there is no border, in the unity of action where myself ends and the world begins. There is no inner and outer, but neural networks, muscular movements of my hand, pencil and paper all work together to put my thoughts down. And the whole body environment system creates my experience of agency, of writing. So I'm not a pure consciousness outside of my own writing, but I'm an ecological self whose borders do not stop at my skin, who embodies the instruments that it uses. Now, cognition and action, as we have seen, are both activities of the embodied subject. However, the development of the specifically human subjectivity requires, of course, interaction with others. It means primarily embodied intersubjectivity or intercorporeality, to use Merleau-Ponty's term. And from birth on, infants have an interpersonal body schema for spontaneous facial imitation of others, for emotional resonance. They experience the other's body as similar to their own, and thus they transpose the seen facial expressions of others into their own feelings and movements. Embodiment and interaffectivity in this way form the basis of social understanding through an interactive practice of meaningful and expressive bodies. And this is how a primary social self develops. Now, if we take a look at the brain side of this early development, then we, of course, can see that the human brain is fundamentally adapted to develop within a social context. Due to its singular neuroplasticity, the human brain is fundamentally adapted to this, and the history of interactions continuously influences the infant's dispositions and skills. Each bodily experience or behavior induces changes in the neural matrix, resulting in ever more adaptive dispositions, so to speak, new open loops. Conversely, from this sedimentation of experience, a modified experience and behavior arises. This may also be studied impressively in higher mammals. For example, in ferrets. Miranka Sur and his group were able to induce a major cortical reorganization in newborn ferrets, which are also born blind at first. Now, Sur and his group cut through one of their optical nerves, connected it with the auditory pathways to the cortex, and afterwards let the ferrets move around. Now, visual stimuli in dependence on motor activity, reached a brain region which normally processes acoustic signals, the auditory region. But surprisingly, the brain adapted to the sensory motor patterns, which were produced by the organism-environment interaction, and gradually the auditory center turned to the visual center, so that the ferrets were finally able to see with the eye normally. This may be expressed in the formula form follows function. Interacting with the environment induces the development of the structures necessary for its adequate perception. Of course, this also applies for the human brain, and similar cortical reorganizations can also be observed after brain lesions or injuries, where patients can relearn major skills just by continuous practice. So interactions create the corresponding brain structures which enable future interactions. That's a kind of circularity which interestingly has been recognized long before the age of neuroscience by the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. I quote, "Only through thinking is the brain formed as an organ of thought and adapted to thinking. It is modified and determined through the habit of thinking this or that, this way or another. But only through the fully shaped organ of thought, thinking itself becomes erudite, skilled, secure. What was effect becomes cause, and vice versa." Of course, we have to consider this not just as an individual development. Thinking is essentially dependent on language acquisition, which in turn is scaffolded by situations of intercorporeality, shared attention, and joint practice. So the social environment is obviously the fitting ecological niche for the brain's development. The embodied mind is intersubjectively formed from birth on. To summarize, I have briefly described three cycles of embodiment. Cycles of organic self-regulation, including a basic affective sense of self. Cycles of sensory-motor coupling between organism and environment, resulting in an ecological self-experience. And cycles of intersubjective interaction, resulting in a social sense of self. And of course, the human brain is crucial for all three modes of embodiment, but it does not create, but it mediates and regulates the cycle. It is inserted into them, and it is in turn shaped and structured by them throughout the lifespan. The brain is certainly necessary for the emergence of consciousness because all circular processes that I have outlined are converging in it. But consciousness only emerges in the overarching system of brain, body, and environment. It is not located in any one place, as I have already argued. And to conclude, I've outlined an ecological embodied view of mind and brain. Mind and brain are both embedded in the relation of organism and environment. And in this view, there is no locus of consciousness. Rather, it is a function or activity of the living being, and thus a phenomenon distributed over organism and environment. It is not brains, but only the living being, or in the human case, the person that is conscious, feels, thinks, perceives, and acts. And as a result, the hard problem of consciousness is wrongly posed. We have to presuppose the existence of living beings in order to find conscious experience in the world at all. We have to presuppose our own existence as living beings in order to do sciences like neurobiology. A world in which no subjects of consciousness occur can at best be described as an abstraction. But this description, this physicalist description, can never provide us with an explanation of the subjects of this description. For these subjects are we ourselves as living embodied beings and not our brains. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you ever so much also for this brief and clear exposition of your thoughts. And now we have a quarter of an hour, the two of you responding to each other, which I will just, because we're a little bit behind in the schedule, but best I can do is shut up and give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you, Thomas. I'll start responding to Thomas, and then we do it the other way around. As I'm sure everyone will not be surprised to hear, I'm very sympathetic to almost everything that Thomas Fuchs said. I'm going to focus on those bits where I think there may be differences, because that's what's interesting. But I want to be clear that when I say I agree with almost everything he said, I enthusiastically agree with the embodied, an activist, ecological view of mind, and the idea of distributed processes, intersubjective processing, and so on, everything that he said along those lines. I'm going to focus on the very beginning of what he said when he spoke of the hard problem not being something soluble because of the way that it's posed. And then he spoke about it being a reductionist, it requires a kind of reductionism which is impossible. And he spoke of a reductionist physicalism, and speaking about, how can you ever find a subjective experience in a physicalist reductionism? It's not possible. So I want to be clear that my view is that a lot hangs on the difference between the word materialist and physicalist. Matter is no longer considered a fundamental property in contemporary physics. It is something which appears as matter under certain circumstances, but which in fact, behind which lie physical processes, physical in the sense of ultimate explanatory forces, but these are not material processes. So I am a reductionist in the sense that I'm a dual aspect monist. I agree with what Thomas was saying, that there's the subject of the mind, the subject of the body experiencing from the inside, and then you can experience the body from the outside, and then you have an object. But this is a dual aspect monist position, which begs the question, well, what then is the thing that unites these two aspects? They're two aspects of what? And for me, this is the thing that can be given a physicalist as opposed to a materialist account. In other words, we can explain it in terms of the basic concepts of physics. The first concept that we need is the concept of self-organization, which Thomas Fuchs referred to. This is a physicalist concept. A self-organization emerges naturally. The work of William Ross Ashby has basically outlined the ideas there. Homeostasis is an expression of the principle of self-organization. Now, self-organizing systems do inhale something, to use the metaphor that Thomas spoke of. They inhale information. They are information processing systems. And information, too, is physical in the sense not of material, but rather as being part of our basic conception of how the universe works. Two entangled electrons, for example, the one carries information about the other. If you know the spin of this electron, then you know the spin of that electron. And so information, I'm just using at random one example of how it's ever since Claude Shannon's work, we've included a measurable, quantifiable, physicalist understanding of information. And self-organizing systems are information processing systems. Information also is inherently subjective. There I will refer to John Wheeler's work on a participatory universe. But I'll just use a very simple example here too, that if there's a bag of marbles of different colors, And let's say we know that there are 3 colors of marbles in there, and one of us knows that one of the colors is blue, and the other one of us doesn't know that, then we have the bag of marbles carries different information. When we actually do our measurement, each of us is going to obtain different information from the bag of marbles. So the information, what the information provided by the measurement depends on what information the subject of the experiment has in the first place. So I think subjectivity, the very notion of self-organizing systems brings about it sort of justifies talking of the point of view of the system and what kinds of questions it needs to ask of its environment in order for it to sustain its own existence. And I don't think these are, and this is my bottom line, I don't think that these are inherently or necessarily biological processes. It is true that they evolved from non-biological self-organizing systems like crystals into ultimately biological self-organizing systems. The whole of evolution is a self-organized, the whole of natural selection is a self-organizing system. But the principles at work preceded the appearance of biological life. And those principles, I think, can be reduced to physics, and in particular to statistical physics. And therefore a mechanistic account is possible. And Dubois-Reymond was wrong, and Chalmers is wrong because fundamentally because they confuse physicalism with materialism. Those are the main comments I wanted to make to get the ball rolling. One last comment. The locus of consciousness. I'm sure many of the people participating will think, oh, so then Mark wouldn't agree with Thomas because he said there's a locus. It's generated by these brainstem structures. So it's terribly important to clarify that they modulate the information processing of the entire brain and spinal cord. There's nothing more distributed in its functionality than what the reticular activating system does. Thanks a million.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. To comment, take up your comments on what we disagree with, on what we disagree on, which is probably more interesting. But let us also point out that, and the idea that in the concept of embodiment of an extended ecological view of the mind, we don't disagree at all, and that is quite something in the current debate and the current situation, where at least in psychiatry we're dealing with hopelessly reductionist concepts, reducing all experience and all mental disorders to the brain as such. Anyway, let us talk about the differences, and it's quite clear that I think the problem of the heart problem is indeed wrongly posed. And I gave several reasons for that. You pointed out that self-organization is a physicalist concept. Yes and no. The self-organization in terms of autopoiesis, as enactivism conceives it, is certainly not something that can be described and even less explained on a merely physicalist level. You say it's you can describe it and explain it in a materialist sense, but then the term materialist is a bit equivocal, because I'm a dual aspect monist as well, as you obviously as you certainly have noticed, and you took it from my position probably. So I'm a dual aspect monist. That means that I think that all what I'm doing right now, namely speaking, is certainly also, and at the same time, an embodied and in that sense material process. So it's not something that somehow hovers over my body and is done by some sort of dualistic soul entity or mind entity. So it's certainly a material process, but that doesn't help very, very much, because it doesn't describe and explain how physical processes described usually in physical terms can have an emergent structure that helps to explain my speaking right now. And I'm quite convinced that my speaking right now needs a higher level top-down causation, so an organization of my physical processes in a way that cannot be described on the level of on the level of physics. Now you could say, well, self-organization is something physical. Yes and no, as I said, because at least it's highly debated whether something like emergence and something like top-down causation can be accommodated with a physicalist worldview. And certainly most philosophers of mind and of science would disagree strongly and say that this is a wrong concept. But then the term self-organization is at least equivocal, it is at least ambiguous. And I'm convinced that the autopoietic structure of the organism, namely as a system that reproduces itself through metabolism, through a constant exchange with the environment, through semi-permeable membranes, which creates the need for exchange and for homeostasis. So metabolism is the basic condition of living beings that creates the need for self-regulation. And in that sense, this is not something that can be simulated or equated to what a machine does. That's also the reason why I don't think that machines like robots, even if they are equipped with artificial intelligence, can ever become conscious or can feel something, because they are not autopoietic systems in terms of living matter, of systems that constantly reproduce all their matter through metabolic exchange with the environment. And this, as I said, creates the need that is essential for living beings, the neediness, the precariousness of life. This precariousness is mirrored in our feeling of pleasant or unpleasant states, as you pointed out. So I think the fact that feeling is as we agree, the fundamental basis of conscious experience is dependent on a special system which may not be described in physicalist terms, because it needs a higher order structure that integrates its particles into a constant self-reproducing exchange with the environment. I don't think that this is really something that you could explain or that you could describe on the level of physics. So that would be my objection. Of course, it is something which happens with matter. So you could call it a materialist concept of life, but then the term materialist is ambiguous. It doesn't say on which level we locate the decisive level of explanation. And here, the lowest level is certainly not enough, not able to explain what happens with a living being on the higher level, even less able to explain why I'm just talking in this way, what my intentions are, why I use these or that words, and why my tongue and my muscles and my nerves work this out in the way they do. This is only possible from a higher level organization, which needs a concept of top-down causation, of top-down organization. I don't think that you could say this is just something that can be described or accommodated on the level of physics. Physics has no, it doesn't even, as I said, it doesn't even, you don't even meet that on the level of physics, because consciousness, qualities, subjectivity is not something that you find when you're restricting yourself to a physicalist description of the world. Well, I think that's enough for the moment.
I think that's a splendid setting out of the basic areas for exploration after we get the questions from the audience, because I think there are very specific things we disagree about, and I'm looking forward to clarifying each other's points of view on those matters.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, exactly. That's what I wanted to say too. I'm kind of bursting with questions, and I think that many of our participants will too. And Tara Löber will now guide you to the process of building these breakout sessions where you will formulate these questions jointly, the questions to our lecturers. So the first question that was put is, just a moment, here it is. Can there be consciousness without representation? Without representations, in plural.
So how we've agreed to do this is I will respond first and Professor Fuchs will respond second. My answer to this first question, can there be consciousness without representations? I presume what is meant by that without mental images. I'll address the other meaning of the word representation in a second. Certainly, as you saw, the child with no cortex, my claim is that she is conscious in that there is something it is like to be her. In other words, it feels like something to be her. But she, without cortex, is incapable of representations, cognitive images, like, for example, the fact that her brother evokes this feeling, which is conscious, doesn't mean she has a conscious image of her brother. Indeed, she is incapable of forming a conscious image of her brother. So in that sense, the answer is yes, there can be consciousness without representations, without conscious representations. But if by the word representation, you're meaning, if I can go down a level to the underlying causal mechanisms, which is what I'm saying as a dual aspect monist, we have our conscious mental states, subjective states of being. We have our external objective perspective upon that, which is the bodily states. I'm saying there are no neuronal representations of images. Here in the subjectivity, there's no experience of conscious images, but the underlying mechanisms, which I'm saying are information processing mechanisms to do with the minimizing of free energy in a self-organizing system, there is something that's called precision. In other words, how much confidence the system has in a particular datum. And that is the representation of uncertainty. In other words, how confident am I in this prediction? How confident am I in this error signal? That applies also to affects. In fact, affects are a representation of uncertainty. So in that mathematical sense, yes, there's always representation, but not in the neuroscientific or in the cognitive sense. Thanks.
May I just add a question from my side to this? Because this kind of basic brainstem consciousness, this without representation, would this be something like a consciousness you are not really aware of? Meaning you don't know that
what you mean by awareness, but the basic definition that Chalmers and Nagel are using of consciousness, namely that there is something it is like to be the organism, something it is like. So a raw feeling of anxiety or a raw feeling of pain doesn't need any cognitions with it. It can, as we find even in psychiatry, there can be free-floating anxiety without there being any notion as to what one is anxious about. One simply feels anxious. That feeling clearly is conscious, even if there's no cognitive content to go with it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think basically I would agree with what Mark already pointed out. The term representation is usually used in neuroscience to convey the idea that somehow the world is mirrored or modeled in the brain. And of course, an embodied and inactive account would be strongly opposed to such an idea. And one of the reasons is certainly precisely what Mark pointed out. It is something it is like to be an organism. It is not something it is like to be a brain. So the brain is always only the an integrator, so to speak. It integrates organismic life. And in order to be conscious, you need no internal modeling or inside picture of the body. It is the body in connection with the brain who is conscious, who is aware in that basic sense. So there is no internalism of representations. On the other hand, the term is often used in psychoanalysis to convey the idea that we have certain images of others in our minds, in our psyche, so to speak. That is, of course, a different notion. I also would be hesitant to call all that representation, because the way the others are somehow present to us is oftentimes just a kind of scheme, a kind of expectation that we implicitly have when we enter a certain situation. So it's not primarily an image in our minds, so to speak, but it is a kind of disposition of interaction with a certain person, which is to a large degree an embodied disposition. So even here, I would be hesitant to use the term representation in all cases. On the other hand, there is certainly a way to have images in one's mind. For example, when I look at this screen right now, and now I close my eyes, of course I can reproduce the image of the screen, and now this could be called a representation of the screen. But that is a special way of intentionality, of remembering and imagining, and it doesn't mean that our whole experience is somehow representational. I would be strongly opposed to such an idea.
So this is where you are close in your models.
Yeah.
So we can move to second question. Okay, fine. Second question is, in case there is the concept of consciousness, then where is the unconscious, also in a psychoanalytical sense, the dynamic unconscious?
Thank you. So for me, as I said ever so briefly in my talk, consciousness is a state of uncertainty. It's a felt state that is the representation of our uncertainty, as I was saying a few minutes ago. To the extent that you are doing predictive work, in other words, you do not know what to do in this situation, to that extent you have to feel your way through the situation. The product of that work is a prediction, which then is stored in what we call long-term memory. And at that point, it is no longer conscious. It is now a prediction that will be run unless it encounters errors and then returns to a state of uncertainty. So that's how I see it, that consciousness is the uncertain predictions. And in cognitive science terms, we're speaking there about working memory, where we're doing predictive work, where you don't have a solution ready to hand. And then the unconscious is the product of that work, where there's relative certainty. When you ask what is the dynamic unconscious, then if in a very quick formulation, obviously these are very complex questions which one can't do full justice to in a few sentences. But in a very quick formulation, in my way of thinking, the dynamic unconscious is that part of the long-term non-declarative memory systems that should, in fact, be returning to consciousness because they're not yet resolved problems, but they don't. In other words, it is that aspect of our predictive model, that aspect of our predictions in long-term memory as to how to go about dealing with life's problems, in which we have an unrealistic sense of certainty. In other words, we are certain where we should not be certain. And this leads to stereotyped responses of which the person is not conscious, and they do not problematize consciously what they're doing when in fact they should. That's a very basic formulation of how I see that question. Thanks.
Well, as you said, it's a very complicated and far-reaching question that cannot be answered in short. So, just to give an idea that a phenomenological and embodied account would, of course, also try to not locate the unconscious precisely as the conscious experience. So, not to ask for where in the brain or where in the organism are the predictions made that might be the basis of the unconscious. A phenomenological account would look for the unconscious precisely in what the margins of our experience anticipate, so to speak, and that would be something like an embodied unconscious. So in our everyday dealing with others, we do not predict something in the scientific sense. So that's what I would be hesitant to call prediction, because that's already a term that is obviously derived from natural sciences. We do not predict, but we unconsciously or implicitly anticipate what could happen, what we might avoid, what the person that we are interacting with might how she or he might behave, and that is to a large part something that we embody in our dispositions of interacting with the world. So it's a kind of implicit anticipation that is, of course, formed through earlier experiences, but that is not somehow located, but it is kind of enacted, embodied in our everyday dealing with others. So if you ask, where's the unconscious? A phenomenologist would say, well, it's in the body memory. It's not somewhere in the brain to be located. It's our way of embodied living, which is to a large extent implicit, so not in the focus of attention, and which even contains something like the dynamic unconscious, because we also have in our embodied dispositions schemes of avoidance, for example, of unconscious anxieties that make us move around certain threatening situations without being aware of why we move around these situations. So, okay.
May I challenge this for a moment? Because I think that is widely the concept of the cognitive unconscious, of the embodied unconscious. This is not a dynamic. There is not like the traumatic past or something that is repressed, because we can learn to avoid the heat of a candle without that being dynamic.
But the traumatic past leaves traces in your embodied memory and makes you avoid and circumvent certain situations unconsciously without necessarily remembering the traumatic event. And in that sense, there is an embodied psychodynamic unconscious. Okay. So I wouldn't see why this couldn't be I wouldn't see why this is different from a dynamic unconscious, because even in a dynamic or psychodynamic view, you would refrain from just ascribing the behavior and the avoidance of the patient just to a certain image or a certain memory, because that memory is often unconscious, obviously.
Yeah. No, the embodiment part is clear to me. And I think this is also a very good solution for the depth of the process. Yeah. But what I loved especially about Marx's solution is that he said the dynamic unconscious is the solutions we have found as a child, and that were solutions maybe adequate to the child's perspective and horizon of possible solutions. But they were not real good solutions, but they were still automatized. And then they are not accessible anymore. I think if I got you right, Mark. And this is a very, very, very sexy thing to conceptualize it like this, because then we get a real difference between the dynamic and the normal, like working unconscious, which we of course need, which is 95% of our mental activity.
Absolutely. I'm not. I don't think that my account would be equivalent to a cognitive unconscious. I would include dynamic unconscious here, but just would not look for it somewhere in the psyche, which doesn't exist, nor somewhere in the brain, or where we at least don't know exactly where we could find that. But I'm looking for the unconscious in my embodied context, so in my embodied dispositions. That would be the difference.
Okay. Just trying to get a little bit of pepper in this dialogue. Okay. Let's turn to the third question. In your view about the process of dreaming in regard to consciousness, are we conscious when we dream? We are embodied. We have motor movements. What about perceptions? And interchange interchange I think it must have with the environment. Interchange with the environment in dreaming.
So the first part of the question is terribly easy to answer. I mean, the definition of a dream is a conscious state during sleep. It's the unconsciousness of sleep punctuated by the consciousness of a dream. So if it's not conscious, it's not a dream. So yes, absolutely, dreams are conscious by definition. I know where the question's coming from. It's because Freud says that an understanding of dreams is that the interpretation of dreams is a royal road to an understanding of the unconscious. But you must remember that's what's latent. That's what the processes that lie behind the manifest or conscious dream. One mustn't confuse the two with each other. Now you make some further very interesting points. You say, in our dreams, are we perceiving? In our dreams, are we acting? Which environment are we interacting with? And so this is a wonderful problem to ponder. And the way that I think about it, which is the same as most people working within a predictive processing or active inference or free energy sort of framework, is that what we're interacting with, even during waking life, is our generative model of the world. We're interacting with our own internalized picture of a world. I know that's what I've just said might upset Thomas, because representation is a swear word to inactivists. But I'm using it in the sense that, like, for example, Varela speaks about each phenotype brings upon its own head its own world. That the world that we're interacting with is a subjective world. It's my world. And so it's a very interesting fact that in dreams, we clearly are having not only perceptions, but conscious perceptions. And we are moving, but we're moving in a virtual reality. We're not moving it. We are actually paralyzed in the outside world, objectively construed. But in the subjective world of the dream, we are enacting and interacting with our environment in just the same way as during waking life. So these are very interesting questions. I'll just add one further point, which is I think it's a very important matter to ask: why are we conscious when we dream? I mean, why should this defining feature of the dream, which intrudes into the unconsciousness of sleep, why should there be a state of consciousness during sleep? And if you think to what I said earlier about what consciousness is, it's a kind of predictive work. It's trying to solve a problem. It's trying to resolve a state of uncertainty. I think that this is good evidence for the view that there is such a thing as dream work, that there is a mental activity going on during dreaming where one is grappling with a problem and where one is navigating a state of uncertainty and trying to resolve that problem. That could be translated into Freudian terms, but I'm sure most of you who are Freudians will be able to make that translation themselves. Thank you.
Well, the question was what about dreaming and consciousness? And I agree, of course, dreaming means to be conscious. It also means to be embodied, because we obviously have the feelings that we have as waking beings, also while dreaming. So there is a constant interaction of brain and body that serves or provides the basis for our conscious states, for our mood states, for our feelings in dreaming. we have no perceptions, of course. So the question is, what are we interacting with in dreaming? I would also not refrain to call this a kind of virtual reality, but that does only make sense when we are as waking beings, not interacting with a model of the world, as Mark put it, but we are interacting with the real world. So we are not, it's not our subjective world that we are interacting with. Of course, the way we are interacting with, the way we are perceiving it is shaped, is modified, is kind of qualified by our own experience. But that doesn't mean that we interact with a model. That makes not even sense to how should I do that? I interact with a model. That is not possible. And it's not even possible in dreaming, in the dream state, because in the dreaming state, I'm part of this virtual world. And of course, that is similar to imagination or daydreaming, where I can imagine myself interacting with all kinds of creatures. And that happens by itself and automatically and passively in dreaming. So in this way, I'm in part embedded in a virtual world that is certainly created by my whole organism without myself being aware of how the organism does it. But it's not that I'm interacting with a model. I'm part of this virtual world in dreaming. Okay, that would be a different way of seeing or phrasing it, at least.
Okay.
Andreas, because you want us to have a little bit of not just each of us giving a speech, I want to say that actually Thomas is right. I phrased it badly. Of course, we are part of the world that we're interacting with. And so I should have said that we generate a world for ourselves within which we are embedded and with which we're interacting. So I stand corrected. Thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, that's what I wanted you to do. Okay, so question 4. Both discussants seem to agree in formulating a basic affective consciousness, a sense of being alive that serves homeostasis and survival. But how does Mark Solms think about higher levels of consciousness, intersubjectivity, empathy, choices between different options and values? So this goes to you, Mark, since the group thinks that it's clear about Thomas's point of view.
Well, I suspect that the question, although it's pointed to me, I think that it applies equally to both of us, because it applies to the premise. Okay, so there's a basic affective consciousness that Thomas and I agree about. And then they're saying, well, what about these higher forms of consciousness? So the way that I look on it is that the affects are the demands made upon cognition. So in other words, there is a state of uncertainty. How do I return to homeostasis? This is a crisis. This is a growing crisis. So that's what the feeling is. And then it's uncertainty about what to do. So what I call prediction, and by the way, there too, I stand corrected by Thomas. I don't mean prediction in the sense of a scientist having an hypothesis and testing it. I mean in the sense of implicit expectations. So if I have an uncertainty about what's going to happen, and in confidence about what shall I do about it, that process, the work that then is performed, is the response to the demand. I'm using these terms, which are Freudian terms. A trieb, a drive, is a demand made upon the mind, by which Freud means das Ich, on the ego, for work. And that's what I'm calling predictive work. In other words, I need to find a solution to this problem. So that is the distinction between the raw affects and the higher forms. In other words, feeling your way into your predictions, feeling your way into your work in progress of solving the problem. Now, that simple distinction can be multiplied over a deep hierarchy. There's not just a thing called cognition. There's an affect about I feel like this about that. That's can be a very primitive state of mind. And then there's a reflection about, oh, it's me who's feeling this about that, and then there's a further thing, and how does that feel about me, and so you have higher and higher degrees of a capacity to abstract yourself from the concrete raw feeling, and more layers of re-representation of that situation. Now, I won't go from there down several paths about, well, what exactly do we mean by empathy? What do we mean by abstract thought? What do we mean by... It's just that's the basic principle. And if I can just tag on to what I've said there about our earlier debate before the breakout sessions, when Thomas and I were talking about... when Thomas was responding to what I was saying about self-organizing systems and reductionism, I think it's important to recognize that a complex, dynamical, self-organizing system is not necessarily a simple thing. It can have a great degree of this kind of hierarchical complexity, which doesn't make it any less of an instance of self-organization. So forgive me for tagging that on to this question. Thanks.
No, that's fine. Well, let me just add, I'm fine with your account completely, and I wanted just to add that as a phenomenologist, I would precisely call this, I feel like this about that, the extension of the basic feeling of being alive, of feeling of a basic embodied self-awareness. It's now extended by what we call intentionality. So the feeling is directed towards something. And I feel like this about that. So that's the next step, so to speak. And you yourself, I think, correlated that to the cortex. The cortex obviously serves to connect the very basic conscious awareness of being alive to the environment, and serves as a basis for this directedness of feelings towards something. That would be the next step, so to speak. An emotion is an intentional basic feeling, a feeling about something. And of course, I cannot go also cannot go into the higher levels then, but I just wanted to add that the phenomena of empathy and of perspective taking, of self-consciousness, are of course crucially related to the interaction with others. So in early childhood, the very basic awareness that probably the fetus already has is now related to intersubjectivity, and only through the interaction with others, through joint attention, through perspective taking, do we get a relation to ourselves, in which consists the reflexive or higher order self-consciousness. Yep. So that would be necessarily social level that we enter here. Okay.
Yeah. And this is highly interesting, that the conscious quality about all these interactive processes and early learning and empathy and mentalization and so stems practically from a very early affective trigger, something like that. And this is the point you agreed on. I think it's terribly interesting that if we look for the highest ranks of reflective reflections, the conscious part of it is like a drive theoretical thing based in the brainstem. I'm really thinking about that.
Absolutely. If you look at Tomasello's account of joint attention, he put that very cognitively in earlier times, but more recently he has extended his account to a more affectively based interaction. So in order to share states of others, share one's own experience with others, we have to have an interest, a drive interest in others. We have to need others, so to speak. It's not just a cognitive loop that is established, but it is something that is derived from our our need, our desire to interact with others. That is the fuel, so to speak, which which is invested in this joint attention and perspective taking.
And we have this extended period of the premature human baby where all this like comes into this wonderful first year of learning. Yeah. Okay, let's turn to the next question. Number 5 is a little bit a longer question. I try to read it. Professor Solms, you started from a premise that you quoted from Freud that feelings are necessarily conscious. We wondered whether this is true. We discussed whether later psychoanalytic theorists disagreed with that, very prominently Bion and also current post-Bionian and relational field theory. It seems that feelings sometimes need to be made conscious first through another, for example, an analyst. Among the same lines, feelings might not be clearly attributable to a specific organism with necessity.
Well, let me start by drawing attention to the fact that I'm speaking about feeling. As I said in my presentation, there are many both denotations of words like emotion and affect, and also different ways in which those terms are operationalized in research. And so what people mean by unconscious affect and unconscious emotion, it's very, very complicated. So to avoid those complexities, I speak about feeling, and I say with Freud, and Freud said this from the first to the last, he said it repeatedly, that feelings are necessarily inherently conscious. And this is both linguistically the case. I mean, it is not a feeling if you don't feel it. That is not to say that there aren't motivational forces at work which you don't feel, but those are not feelings. It's precisely once they become a feeling that we call them feelings. And please note what I said in my presentation and now also in this discussion, that it's not just a word. We're speaking about a particular function, that the capacity to feel your own states of uncertainty, in other words, knowing whether things are going badly or going well, knowing it through feeling, whether to be able to palpate your uncertainty is the very basis of choice. And so if you are unconscious, and remember we were speaking earlier about a definition of what is dynamically unconscious, is something about which one inappropriately does not have uncertainty, where one acts with false certainty, with unjustified certainty. There you see what is lost when something is not felt. So it's not just a word, it's a function. And that function is terribly important to the work that we do in psychoanalysis and the way that we conceptualize psychopathology. And so what we're trying to do in analysis is to get the patient to be able to feel their own uncertainties. That's the main point that I wanted to make, rather than to simply repeat false certainties. In other words, actions which have the expectation that they will result in a reduction of uncertainty, but in fact those are incorrect expectations. That's the main thing. There's a whole lot else that could be said, like referencing the earlier point that was being made between Andreas and Thomas about trauma. We say there the person responds unconsciously. On the basis of prior traumatic experience. But it's very important there to distinguish between the two aspects of consciousness that we've been distinguishing between all along, the more affective felt part and the knowledge, the cognitive part as to what those feelings are about. The patient is not necessarily unconscious of the feeling, but they just do not know where the feeling comes from. And they do not own the intentionality that arises from it. Thanks.
Yeah, precisely. I can just follow up on this. I think the problem in this question arises from the still dualist assumption that there is either consciousness or there is consciousness, or there's something subpersonal wherever in the brain or in the psyche to which we have no access. But that cannot be the case, because it's completely true that we are sometimes not aware of what we exactly feel. We are aware of a very diffuse state, but others are sometimes much better able to point out what we really feel. So is it then conscious or is it non-conscious? Well, you could say it's pre-conscious, but that doesn't solve the problem. As soon as you have divided the mental life into something which is conscious and known, and into something which is completely non-conscious, then I think the problem arises. As soon as you say, "Well, I'm to a certain degree conscious of my current feeling, and to a certain degree I don't know exactly what I feel." Let's think of alexithymic patients who have a kind of bodily experience, but they have no intentionality to connect this experience to their situation. So in this sense, the feeling is there. It's certainly not completely non-conscious, but it is also not conscious in the sense of being experienced in the intentional mode, so related and directed towards a certain situation. That is sometimes much better seen by others, by other persons, or by the analyst, of course.
Thank you, Thomas. That's the last part of what you're saying. If I can just summarize it in a very, I think that what's at issue here is, can you have a feeling without being able to name that feeling? Yeah. And the answer is yes, of course you can.
Of course.
But it is of great benefit to be able to name your feeling, to be able to, in this way, make it accessible to all sorts of higher cognitive processes.
Absolutely.
There was a question in the chat about autism. I don't know if this would fit this line of questioning here about like the diminished interest in interaction with others in autistic individuals. Would you think it has something to do with what we are discussing here?
Well, at least I think in terms of the level of consciousness, as it says in the question, I don't think that this has been affected in autism. So there is no kind of less consciousness, so to speak, or less consciousness of feelings. I think the problem in autism is a kind of lacking resonance, lacking musicality for the expressiveness of other persons. And that is a kind of interactive deficit, which doesn't affect consciousness as such, I would say.
Okay.
Yes, I think it can be neatly tied to what you two were discussing earlier about empathy. The way it was spoken of them.
Yeah.
So I think we can go to the sixth question, which is like with regard to Professor Solms, where is it located? I didn't understand in the question what was located where. Maybe consciousness, I guess. But you said this. But okay, you may repeat it. With regard to Professor Fuchs, is the unconscious just a function of interaction of the individual with the environment?
So yes, I can answer very briefly my part of that question, which is, as Professor Hamburger said, I have in fact already addressed that. I think that the function, if you mean by where is it located, if you mean anatomically speaking, then we're speaking about the function of the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray. The reticular activating system is the modulator of postsynaptic gain, and that is a highly distributed process throughout the brain and the spinal cord. So it's when I say that it's located in the reticular activating system, I don't mean that the whole thing exists just there. It has to do with the function of modulating the whole of the rest of the nervous system. Then the periaqueductal gray has to do with then the error signals descending back upon the upper brainstem. So again, periaqueductal gray is the recipient of all of that feedback. But that doesn't, you must remember that feedback is from the whole of the nervous system. And then let us not forget what Thomas Fuchs has been telling us all of this meeting. And that in turn is about the body. It's the whole of the nervous system in turn interacting with the whole of the organism. So I'm both a localizationist and a not a localizationist. I hope you can see in the way we call it dynamic localization.
Okay. I'm fine with that as long as you take the whole organism into account. There's always a kind of polarity between localizing and seeing the higher level organization, where the local is only part of, the local is integrated, so to speak. And we can always look at both levels, so to speak. Regarding the question posed to me, is the unconscious just a function of interaction of the individual with the environment? Well, yes and no. It's not just a function of the interaction. So I would claim that the unconscious is something that can be found in a disposition that we carry into our interaction with the environment, and this disposition is embodied in an extended sense. So it is embodied in our embodied expectations, implicit anticipations, in the way we usually deal with situations without being aware of. And then this embodied dispositions belonging to body memory, one could say, of course, enter the situations, and now they become actualized through our interaction, and particularly, of course, through our interaction with others. And then we have not only the embodied unconscious of one part, but we have the relational unconscious, so the implicit level of interaction that creates and lets emerge new phenomena of unconscious interaction, because both partners now carry their embodied dispositions into this resonant process. So we have not only the embodied unconscious, but also the actualized unconscious in the interaction, and then the relational unconscious that is brought about by the interaction of both body memories, so to speak. So that would be a more differentiated answer to this question.
Yeah, which goes really quite a lot in my direction of interpersonal psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I get yes.
Yes. Okay. There was another question in the chat, but we are really short with our time now. And so I would go to the last question, because this is another huge one. And it was already addressed before about the higher levels, higher complex states. I read it. How are more complex states of consciousness represented in both Solms's and Fuchs's model? A, for example, going for a date, and the group suggested, isn't there also pleasure of uncertainty? If going for a date is not just like uncertainty as a need state. And B, reverie, the analyst produces dreams about the analyst that are helpful in a way not foreseeable by both. So who of you would like to comment on this question?
Well, I'm happy to. Bearing in mind the time, I'll be brief. So I want to return to what I said about there being different categories of need. It's terribly important that they are categorical. For all the reasons that I explained earlier, it actually licenses the introduction of quality into statistical physics. And so we have multiple needs. When we're going on a date, there are many emotions involved. One of them may be lust, if you're talking about that kind of date, hoping that this is going to end in your sexual interest being reciprocated. There would also be seeking, in other words, wanting to learn and understand about this person. There would also be attachment. Is this person the affectionate side of your, and there would be playfulness and so on. So all of these are different emotions. which register different needs. Ultimately, all of them are homeostatic. And so how is this going? Is this going well? Shall I revert to plan B? Or it's felt uncertainty, all of it. So although it's, we're talking about a very simple mechanism, that mechanism is multiplied across all of our categories of need. And then there are higher and higher cognitive representations of this business. And again, I use the word, not in the nasty sense of the word of representations. You know what I mean by that. Higher order elaborations of the attempt to solve these problems. But I want to conclude by drawing your attention to the fact that no matter how high and reflective and complex these things are, ultimately the conscious part of it has to do with your feeling of uncertainty as to how well you're doing in relation to how you hope things will turn out and whether they actually are or are not, and what else might you do if they're not turning out as expected. So in all of these complexities of our relationships, there's still a very simple principle at the bottom of it all. Thanks.
Thank you. And I do think that the second part of the question, with the wonderful example of the unforeseeability of the related dreaming in psychoanalysis, has been answered in a way by what Thomas said for the last question, like exactly this very complex interplay of both these embodied persons with all their implicit memories in them, and so reacting to each other.
That's a kind of participatory sense making, we would call it in activism. So both bring their embodied dispositions and implicit expectations into the process, and oftentimes it complements the tendencies and unconscious directions the other could take or will take. So there's a kind of complementary interaction in this case, and that is helpful for the psychoanalytic process, of course. But it's precisely what you said, an interaction of embodied memories here.
Yeah, which is also really very interesting model, I do think. So thank you very much for answering these questions, and also thank you, dear avatars outside, for the questions. And I think we should give Thomas and Mark just an opportunity to have their concluding. It will be a little bit of a briefer exchange now, I do think. But whatever you would like to sum up this discourse and this discussion.
Well, for me, it's been a very intellectually enjoyable and emotionally enjoyable experience. I hope that it is plain for all to see, both that although Thomas Fuchs and I come from different intellectual traditions, we are converging upon pretty much common ground on all the things that really matter. And one of the things that matters to me, which is what I would like to end with, is that when we speak about this fundamental role of affect, and behind that of these homeostatic mechanisms, we're talking about what Freud called drive theory. So in all of these modern and fashionable, increasingly so, in the philosophy of mind and in cognitive science and in affective neuroscience and in the whole, we mustn't lose sight of that there's a way in which the centrality of drives, of the embodied nature of the mind, which is what drive theory is all about, is coming back into focus. And that can only be a good thing for psychoanalysis. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin.
Yes, it was a very stimulating interaction and discussion with not only with Mark, but with all of you. And thank you. Thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. I wanted to just say that we not only agree on very important issues, but I also learned a lot from Mark about the importance of affectivity and the basic affective neuroscience that helps us to locate the basic conscious awareness really in the organism. The only thing that occurred to me is that precisely because you emphasize the homeostatic basis of the conscious mind, Mark, it seems strange to me that you think that this could be somehow simulated or created by an information processing system, because precisely an information processing system has no homeostasis unless it is an organism. So, and precisely with that, the whole basis of affectivity is lost. And I don't see how this could be generated by an artificial mind or an artificial system. But we needn't go into this debate, maybe another time.
I deeply agree with that. I knew I would get you there sooner or later. Now it's later. This is why I quoted Chalmers in the beginning. This is a virtual reality thing. Yeah. I don't think it works, because if a computer has never changed his diapers, he won't have the affective life we need for consciousness. But yeah, I think I'm also very grateful for this exchange. I will just show, for the goodbye, I will show my slides again. Thank you very much to all. And if Horst would have been with us, he would have deeply enjoyed this discussion, especially because of the link between consciousness and affective life, because Horst Kächele was a really very affective thinker. I used to call him the trumpet of Jericho, because he sometimes he shouted his ideas. It was really wonderful to discuss with him. And I just wanted for the audience to alert you of, this is the first webinar of a series of Horst Kächele webinars we are going to screen on IPU, and the next one will be in July this year, conducted by Heidi Levitt, a very important qualitative research and psychotherapy research, with Phil Langer from our university and Sharon Horn, about really trying to get qualitative research into the guidelines, into the respected and accepted corpuses of research. And I think it's a very good thing, and you're invited to participate also in this. And then in over a year, February 23, we will have Christopher Moran, one of also the great researchers on rupture and repair, and he will teach and discuss his process. And then in the last webinar, which will be in July 23, then all our 4 professors, one of them double, this is Mark Solms, guest professors in the Horst Kächele guest professorship, will discuss with each other the different angles and points of view psychoanalytic research can go in the future. And so we do hope as IPU that we can contribute to the future of this enterprise I call psychoanalysis, not just the science. Okay, thank you to all of us, especially Mark and Thomas, for your really most interesting lectures and discussions. And see you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Mark.
Tara. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andreas. And thanks to all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.